The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Jonathan Allen with a behind-the-scenes look at Joe Biden's 2020 campaign. Fred Wertheimer on why now is the time for a historic overhaul of how we do elections. Plus, Bill Press with Congressman Jamie Raskin on the state of play in Congress and why it's time to get rid of the filibuster. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Jonathan Allen's newest book, co-authored with Amy Parnes, takes a deep dive into Joe Biden's narrow victory that put him in the White House. It's a story in part about how progressive Democrats, faced with the possibility of another 4 years of Trump, were able to coalesce behind a centrist candidate. And we say hello to Jonathan Allen, senior national politics reporter for NBC News and co-author with Amy Parnes of the new book, Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. John Allen, thanks for joining us again on the America's Democrats podcast.
It's my pleasure, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you with us. And your book is, I guess, being described as the first inside view to how Biden won the 2020 election. Why was it important to write this book?
Well, number one, I think it's always valuable to have a little bit of a history on how these campaigns are run behind the scenes. I think it's valuable for the public to get that and to get a sense of, who the new president is and how they make decisions. But in addition to that, I think there are a lot of valuable lessons for Democrats going forward that come from this book and certainly from our last book, Shattered, and also for Republicans from both of those.
Now, you describe a Democratic Party during the Biden campaign as a party at odds with itself. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, you've got this sort of interesting dynamic going where the Democratic Party, I think, has certainly in terms of the voices that have emerged over the course of the last few years and in the shadow of the Obama administration, really kind of found their progressive roots and in some ways came up with new progressive thinking. And it looked like a party that was moving, to the left and embracing a lot of its instincts and values. And at the same time, the nomination contest ends up going to a candidate who has not only been around for a long time, but has certainly not been on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and for the most part campaigned as a centrist, both in the primary and in the general election, certainly more than one would gauge from his presidency so far.
Yeah, he has definitely been a kind of a poster child for the middle, I think is probably fair to say with given his full career. But what did Democrats have to do to resolve those differences and offer full support to Biden during the campaign?
I mean, we write in the book a lot about the coalescing of the Democratic Party and really in a lot of different ways. I mean, you see, for example, I think in the primary, for the most part, there were a couple of exceptions. There was really limited what you'd call like sort of hardball tactics against Biden, right? The relationship between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden is one that is respectful. One that's pretty good. We write in the book, report for the first time, that Biden advised Bernie Sanders during the primary against Hillary Clinton in 2016 and told Sanders what he'd have to do to be more effective against her. So I think but I think what you see over the course of the primary, and even as the primary is winding down after South Carolina and Pete Buttigieg gets out and Klobuchar gets out, and then Sanders kind of backs off of Biden a little bit during the rise of the pandemic, and eventually gets out himself and comes to terms with Biden on a platform. I think what you saw mostly was the Democratic Party very afraid of another 4 years of Donald Trump and willing to suppress some of its instincts and if not its values, certainly its kind of true north in order to beat Trump.
I was kind of hoping you would say that because I was wondering how much of a factor that was as opposed to anything just over on the left. If maybe you put all of that aside and say, look, we just can't have 4 more years of that guy.
I mean, I think that's very much what we saw, because if you look at Biden and his message, I mean, at one level, battle for the soul of America is pretty anodyne and generic. At another level, though, it was intended to, I think, incorporate all of the different pieces he was going to need to beat Trump. And that's everybody from, on a political level, everybody from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to the never Trump Republicans. And everything that he did in his campaign was pretty easy to put under that umbrella of this is, America, your concept of America is at stake. And that was the unifying thing for, I think, a lot of folks. Like, no matter how far on the left you are in terms of wanting to reform the system, rebuild the system, I think there are certain elements of our institutions and our politics that you respect. The sort of small r republicanism, in addition to small d democracy, and the same thing is true of those folks on the right edge that are sort of disaffected Republicans and educated suburban women that tend to vote with Republicans in security elections. I think that's something that everybody can identify, and you end up in a place where the Democratic Party really has a monopoly right now on both small d democracy and small r republicanism.
Now, John, as the candidate Biden himself moved through this campaign, what would you say are some of the more critical decisions made by the campaign that, in fact, helped him win?
I think coming out with a message to begin with that was about what he would do for other people, which was a little more than just restoring the soul of America or battling for the soul of America. It was, in addition to that, talking about the backbone of the middle class and talking about that as union jobs in particular, and expanding the ability of people to join unions and strengthen them. I think that those were critical things in terms of, as a contrast with Hillary Clinton, whose slogan was, I'm with her. It was very much about her. These were things that were about what Biden would do for other people. And I don't think he ever really lost sight of that being necessary as part of his messaging, whether it was the big slogans or individual policy pieces. I think he was very connected to the idea of needing to express that as what's he going to do for other people. So I think that's number one, and it's kind of an umbrella for everything. In terms of specific decisions, I think they were very smart to stay in the race when so many people were telling Biden to get out. And really, I mean, it gets down to a point, and we report this in the book, where in New Hampshire, after he comes in fourth in Iowa and he's about to come in fifth in New Hampshire, his campaign aides go to him with, basically a request that he think about refinancing his house, taking out his second mortgage, so that he can pay payroll. He has to keep telling Jill Biden, just hang in there, hang in until South Carolina. I think they made smart decisions in the primary around forward funding their very little campaign money into Nevada to win second place. And I think that his courtship of Jim Clyburn over a long period of time ends up paying huge dividends when Clyburn gets in and endorses him. And then in the general election, the decision to stay inside, much mocked, but the decision to stay at home and to model behavior and to keep control of his message, which his aides were always worried about during the pandemic, he let Trump go out there and shoot himself in the foot. So, I mean, all of those are sort of big, important strategic decisions that I think led to the victory. And one more that I would add: in the general election, he was facing a lot of pressure, even from his own campaign aides, to go to the left on police reform, to say defund the police, to apologize for the crime bill. And we detail this in the book, the sort of internal debate that goes on there. He ends up saying that he essentially embracing some of the police reform ideas, but he never goes to that place of defund the police or apologizing for the crime bill. And it made it harder for Trump to make the case against him that he was, going to defund the police, that he was going to make neighborhoods unsafe. I think that message worked against some of the other Democrats running last year, but it did not work against Biden.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Jonathan Allen, senior national politics reporter for NBC News and co-author with Amy Parnes of the new book, Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. John, when all is said and done, your central thesis is that, as I just mentioned, Biden got lucky. Why lucky?
Well, so number one, let me broaden that out a little bit. So yes, Biden got lucky. Number two, the Democratic Party was lucky that it arrived at this guy who was first elected to the Senate in 1972, who'd run for president twice before, who looked terrible on the campaign trail in the early states. I think it's the party was lucky that it nominated Biden. You can't do a counterfactual. I don't know what happens if Bernie Sanders is the nominee, or Elizabeth Warren, or Kamala Harris, or anybody else. But given the closeness of this race and the fact that Democrats were able to win both those blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and Arizona and Georgia, it is hard for me to envision one of the other candidates doing all of those things at the same time. Biden's coalition of African Americans on one side and moderate whites on the other seem to be very crucial. But in addition to those two things, we see after the election with Trump's fraudulent claims of fraud, how fragile our system is, and how any of those court decisions, any decision by a Republican state official to muck things up, really could have changed not only the outcome of the presidential election, but maybe the trajectory of the Republic. So I think we're all lucky to a large extent that our Republic held firm. Now, with regard to Biden himself, I start backward a little bit from, people say he won by 8 million votes, and so this was a huge election, or 306 electoral votes to 232, the same as Trump. Trump claimed a mandate from that, said it was a huge win, and people laughed at him for the very reason that it would have taken 77,000 votes for Hillary Clinton to flip those blue wall states and be president. Biden, likewise, you look at Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia. They account for about a 43,000 vote margin, smaller than the Hillary margin, and Trump is president of the United States. So start a little bit backward from that. I mean, it's a very close election in a way that I think many Democrats don't appreciate, and to their own peril. But just one other thing on that. I mean, so the closest to the election has something to do with it. But the fact that Biden comes as a two-term former vice president, comes in fourth in Iowa. The day of the Iowa caucuses, the app that reports the results fails. I don't know how many people remember that, but it was kind of a big deal, and ends up being the story coming out of Iowa, which means that Biden's failure is not the story coming out of Iowa. Even a couple of days before that, there was a Des Moines Register poll that considered the gold standard of polling before Iowa, and it is both a bellwether of where things are and an influencer of how Iowans vote. The Buttigieg campaign got that thing spiked based on one bad phone call, and it would have shown Biden in fourth place with 13% of the vote, which could have been destructive to his campaign. He comes in second in Nevada. He says he's got to come in second to keep going to South Carolina. They were looking for a strong second. He beats Buttigieg by a couple of points. Sanders is running up the score there. You see in Nevada, again, Elizabeth Warren comes in and takes out Mike Bloomberg, who at the time was looming over Biden's shoulder, trying to take away his endorsers, trying to get his political support. There are just all these sort of, and we go through all of them in the book, but there are all these sort of moments where if something outside of Biden's control had gone the other way, he doesn't make it to South Carolina. He doesn't get that huge lift from Clyburn, the huge victory. And he doesn't get the coalescing of the Democratic Party behind him. And then, of course, in the general election, Anita Dunn, one of his top advisors, said to an associate, as we report in the book, COVID is the best thing that ever happened to Joe Biden, meaning that Trump really mishandled the main crisis in his presidency. And at the same time, it allowed Biden to be very selective about what issues he spoke about, when and how. And the ability to control message for somebody who has been undisciplined in the past is a huge advantage.
Yeah, I actually think that he did remarkably well in this campaign and keeping any gaffes to an absolute minimum, which is very uncharacteristic for Joe Biden, of course. And John, as someone who has written extensively about campaigns, was there a specific point in time when you realized that, wow, Biden could actually win this election?
I don't think there was ever a time where it looked impossible, except for Iowa and New Hampshire and Nevada. That period in February, because he started as the plurality candidate in the Democratic Party, so there was always sort of a chance that he was going to win, and maybe a better, I wouldn't say better than even, but perhaps a better chance than anybody else for long periods of time. I think there was a moment where Elizabeth Warren really rose up and looked like she might win the nomination. I think Sanders in the early caucus and primary contests looked for a moment like he had a chance to win. But there was never a point where Biden was really so out of it that you didn't consider him a possibility, I guess, with the possible exception of that February period. And then with regard to the head-to-head with Trump, he was ahead in polling and by so much for so long that he always seemed like at least a reasonable shot to win. I think what I know what the mainstream media and what Democrats were unaware of was how close the race was when there was that big polling gap. Even within the Biden campaign, and we report on this in the book, they adjusted their polling models because they didn't trust them to make sure that they were basically including more people or greater weight to people who are not college-educated whites because of what we would colloquially call a hidden Trump vote. And then on election night, as they go into the election, the Biden people feel pretty good about where they are, and as the results start coming in, they're feeling worse. There's a real fear, and all of them are getting contact from their friends and political allies, saying, "What the hell's going on here? Is this deja vu from 2016?" So in a way, I think Democrats were lulled a little bit into a false sense of security by that polling that everybody saw. And that's our measure. Those are our snapshots. And then as election night wore on and into the second day, really when you got some vote drops from Michigan and Wisconsin overnight, election night to the next day, you start to see that path where Biden's probably going to be able to win. But when Fox News called Arizona at 11 o'clock at night for Biden, not only were the Trump people confused by that call, so were the Biden people.
So was I. I was kind of shocked by it that Fox, even if they knew, I was surprised that they would even come out and say it. I want to point out that this isn't just a book about the past; it's about the future. So, what would Democrats learn about how close this election was and how Biden was able to win?
I think there are a couple of big lessons here, and it really is mostly, I think, about where the party is now and how it moves to the future. So the now part is, in order to have a progressive agenda move forward, they really needed their centrist candidate. And I think I know a lot of black voters supported Biden in part because he was somebody who could be competitive with Trump for moderate white votes. Sort of a sophisticated view of the election. This is the best way to get rid of Trump, is to go with this guy who can, talk a little bit more like Archie Bunker sometimes, but govern like, Lyndon Johnson or FDR. Pick whichever one that Biden likes to claim he's the next version of. So then the question is, for Democrats, how do they either, and particularly progressives in the Democratic Party, how do they either get more support for their agenda so that somebody who shares it and shares their views can sort of be open about that and win the presidency, or how do they mask some of that in the way that the way Biden did, in order to continue winning elections? And that's something for Democratic officials and voters and whoever to figure out. But I think, sort of taking stock of where they are and how narrowly they escaped what they would view as the disaster of a second Trump term is very important for trying to understand that discussion going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And before we let you go, I mean, so now we have the GOP launching campaigns across the country to limit access to voting. What does that tell you about how Republicans even view their political future?
I mean, it tells me that they think that the way to win elections is not to get more people to vote for them, but to get fewer people to vote. And that's, I think for many years, there have been indications that that's where the Republican Party wanted to go. It's never been so brazen or comprehensive. There was always a debate within the Republican Party about voting rights and, some discomfort with trying to close off voting rights. That debate does not exist right now.
Yeah. It's pretty phenomenal to me. And I think something they should take away from this is that maybe it's time to look in the mirror and look at how they're governing. Perhaps that might be the issue. And then you open up and then you encourage other people to vote because you do things that they want to vote for. Just my 2 cents on that one.
Yeah, no,
Jonathan,
it's probably worth $10, those 2 cents.
Right. Jonathan Allen, senior national politics reporter for NBC News, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Also, co-author with Amy Parnes of the new book, Lucky, How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. John, as always, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, what will it take to fix our broken democracy? First, though, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Those in the know say that we the people should forget any progressive fantasy that, at long last, Washington might finally produce the kind of bold FDR-style agenda that America needs. They smugly lecture us that recalcitrant Republicans in Congress, not to mention a swarm of corporate lobbyists, are opposed to progressive change, so who would get it passed? Here's an idea. Try the people themselves. Those in the know don't seem to know it, or don't want us to know it, but big majorities across grassroots America are strongly in favor of the fundamental changes that Washington elites are rejecting. For example, 2/3 of America, including a majority of moderate Republicans, say yes to doubling the minimum wage. 72% of the people, including 46% of professed Republicans, shout their approval for Medicare for all. 8 out of 10 Americans, including strong majorities of Republicans, support a paid family leave program like every other developed nation provides for their people. What about increasing taxes on the rich, expanding Medicaid for poor families, raising teacher pay, spending more for early childhood education, Yes, 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 say majorities, not just in blue states, but also in GOP strongholds like Idaho, Nebraska, and Utah. These are not just poll numbers, but solid ideas embraced last year by a broad cross-section of voters in ballot elections across the country. For example, Florida voters enacted a constitutional initiative to up the state's minimum pay to $15, with yeas topping nays by a whopping margin of more than 20 points, making it even more popular than either Trump or Biden. This is Jim Hightower saying, instead of fearing the people, Democratic leaders need to get out of Washington and join the people. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. As Congress prepares for a showdown over a massive voting rights bill, democracy advocate Fred Wertheimer says passing the For the People Act is essential to make sure America does not return to the days of Jim Crow politics. And we say hello to Fred Wertheimer, founder and president of Democracy 21. He is a recognized national leader and spokesman on money and politics issues, including campaign finance, ethics, lobbying, and transparency reforms. Fred Wertheimer, thanks very much for joining us again today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you with us. You recently testified before the Senate Rules Committee in support for the For the People Act. How important is it right now that this bill actually passes?
Well, it's essential. This legislation repairs our democracy and addresses any number of major problems that we have as a result of having a broken political system and a corrupt campaign finance system. At the center of the battle right now is all of the efforts going on by Republicans in state legislatures to enact what would be the greatest voter suppression effort since the Jim Crow era. So this goes to the heart of whether every American, every eligible voter is going to get to exercise their sacred right to vote. It also gets directly at the fact that the system in Washington is rigged by influence-seeking big money contributors and funders. And it also deals with efforts that will take place in 2022 to gerrymander districts all over the country unless this legislation is passed, which requires nonpartisan redistricting commissions for federal House seats. This is the opportunity of a generation to fix our democracy. So it's absolutely essential that this bill be enacted.
Your testimony focused on the influence of big money in politics, and you've been working on this issue for decades. How are we seeing this influence play out today that's, say, different from when you began this work?
Well, in part, it's the absolute sheer amount of money flooding Washington. In the last election, the 2020 election, over $14 billion was spent on presidential and congressional races. That is twice as much as was spent in the 2016 election. The system today is made up and dominated by influence-seeking contributions from billionaires, millionaires, bundlers, lobbyists, super PACs, special interest PACs, and dark money nonprofit groups. This money has extraordinary impact on the way in which Congress makes decisions and it undermines the interests of more than 300 million Americans. So the problem is as bad as I have ever seen it in decades of work on this. The solution we have since Citizens United has eliminated the ability to limit unlimited contributions going to outside spending groups, the reforms we have, first of all, end dark money and require all contributions being made to influence federal elections to be disclosed. And secondly, give candidates an alternative way to finance their campaigns. It's a voluntary option, but if they take it, office holders will be free from being dependent on and obligated to the influence-seeking big money funders who now provide the financial support for them to run for office. It frees up office holders to represent their constituents rather than representing big money funders in Washington.
And Republicans have portrayed the For the People Act as a power grab by Democrats. But what's wrong with that assessment?
Well, it's not a power grab by Democrats. It's a power grab by the American people. The fact of the matter is, this is not a partisan bill. The reforms in this bill are overwhelmingly supported by the American people, including Democrats, independents, and Republicans. This is a partisan bill from the standpoint of Republicans being partisan in their opposition. I spent decades working on bipartisan campaign finance bills with Republican leaders and Republican supporters. That's impossible today because they have decided that the status quo benefits them politically, so we can't get support from any Republicans. But the reality is that's not because it's a partisan bill for the American people. It's not because it's a power grab. What it will do is create a much fairer and honest system. It is a partisan bill to Republicans in Congress because they want to prevent it, because they think their partisan advantages will be undermined by the bill. This is not about Democrats or Republicans in Congress as far as we're concerned. It's about the interests of 330 million Americans. Those interests are greatly advanced by this legislation.
And we're speaking with Fred Wertheimer, founder and president of Democracy 21. Of course, Fred is also a recognized national leader and spokesman on money in politics issues, including campaign finance, ethics, lobbying, and transparency reforms. And Fred, as often pointed out, the For the People Act seems likely to face a filibuster in the Senate. But the New York Times recently reported that there's been some thinking that Democrats may break up the bill into smaller pieces to avoid a filibuster. What's wrong with that approach?
Well, first of all, Democrats in Congress haven't been saying that. A few academics and pundits have suggested you drop everything and just deal with voting rights. That's just dead wrong, and strategically, it makes no sense at all. If you look at the circumstances, we're not going to get Republican senators to break a filibuster. We're not going to get 10 Republican senators. Everyone realizes that. There are 49 senators co-sponsoring this bill, including every Democrat in the Senate and 2 independent senators. The House has passed this bill twice as a whole bill. This bill has reforms in it that are extremely important to dealing with the corrupt campaign finance system, with extreme partisan gerrymandering, with ethics and self-dealing abuses in the government. And no one who has made this suggestion has pointed to why the one senator, Democratic senator, who is not co-sponsoring it would change his mind because of everything else being dropped. In fact, Senator Manchin, who co-sponsored the bill in 2019, has made clear that he thinks the campaign finance reforms are extremely important. He has said he has and will continually support efforts to change the campaign finance rules. So this is strategy without a strategy. There is absolutely no reason to believe that Republicans, whose greatest objection today is in the voting rights provisions, will stop filibustering. And there's no indication, no reason to believe that the one Democrat who will take this over the top over a filibuster, Senator Manchin, will do so because everything else is being dropped. This makes zero sense from a strategic standpoint.
What's your position, Fred, on how Democrats should be dealing with the filibuster?
Well, there are some important things to be remembered. The filibuster has been changed over the years by rules changes. There is one study that shows 160 bills have been passed that have exceptions to the filibuster rule. The last senator to make an exception to the filibuster rule was none other than Senator Mitch McConnell, who set the record for filibusters when he was blocking the Obama administration agenda. Our view is that why should there be an exception, the McConnell exception, so you could confirm Supreme Court justices, which he then did 3 times, but not an exception to repair our democracy, to prevent the greatest voter suppression efforts in decades, to fix a corrupt campaign finance system. It makes no sense that Senator McConnell can have an exception to confirm a Supreme Court justice, and you cannot make an exception to repair the rules of democracy. So our view is that this is a situation where the filibuster rule cannot be allowed to prevent the country from fixing our political system and preventing voter suppression. What's good enough for Senator McConnell should be good enough to repair our democracy for the American people. So we believe the Democrats should figure out whatever it takes to ensure that Senator McConnell cannot block this bill with a filibuster.
And of course, in addition to legislation on voting rights and fair elections, there needs to be activism. And you recently launched a project called Repair Our Democracy. What's the purpose of this project?
Well, this particular project is a communications project. We are putting out releases and statements every day. We are rebunking false challenges made against the bill. We're explaining various provisions of the bill. We want to make sure that there is a maximum effort on a daily basis to inform the media and thereby the public about why this bill must be passed, about why these arguments against it are false and sometimes downright lies, and why the American people should continue their overwhelming support for the bill. So that's what the Repair Our Democracy project is. It's a project for Democracy 21 being run by an organization called Coalesce Strategies for Us.
All right, Fred Wertheimer, founder and president of Democracy 21, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Fred, as always, we appreciate your time with us today. Look forward to having you back again with us soon.
It's a pleasure to be back with you again.
And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press with Congressman Jamie Raskin on the fight to enact progressive reforms in Congress and why he supports a full abolition of the filibuster.
The flags over the White House are at half-staff again today in memory of victims of a mass shooting. This is the second week in a row. Last week it was Atlanta. Today it is Boulder, Colorado. After Sandy Hook, after Las Vegas, after Charleston, we saw no actions on gun safety. Is there any chance that this time will be different?
Well, those are the spectacular episodes of mass gun violence. But a mass shooting is more than 4 people, and we have on average more than 1 a day. So in a certain sense, from the perspective of my friends in the GOP and the NRA, this is business as usual, and they want the society to get accustomed and conditioned to it. They would like people to think that there's something normal about this. This is why they call it a tragedy. It's like somebody coming down with cancer. A tragedy is Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet. These are crimes, and they are preventable crimes, but we would need to conform our laws to what most of the rest of the world has. We would need to have a meaningful universal background check for violent criminals and the deranged and fugitives and domestic felons and so on. This is what we just passed in the House, completely on party lines. The Republicans are overwhelmingly opposed to it. In Washington, although when you get outside of Washington, we have mass bipartisan support. 75 or 80% of the people support even a ban on assault weapons. And when you talk about a universal background check, we're up around 95 or 96% of the people who want to close the private gun show loophole, the internet loophole, and the private sale loophole. Just totally common sense constitutional things to do.
And the president today, before he went out to Columbus, he spoke to this, called for Congress to pass, the Senate to pass the 2 bills that the House passed earlier this week or last week, and also called for renewing the ban on assault weapons as well as high capacity magazines. Again, do you see any chance at all in the Senate?
Well, the Senate, the Senate is possible because the Republicans in the Senate, because they represent an entire state, have to respond to a lot more people than most of the Republicans in the House who occupy gerrymandered territory. And, gerrymandering has been the coin of the realm in the House. And we're trying to deal with that in H.R. 1 by abolishing gerrymandering and mandating independent redistricting commissions, which also the Republicans are vehemently opposing because they understand that is the key to their dominance in Ohio and Wisconsin and North Carolina and Pennsylvania before the state Supreme Court threw out those districts. But they're going to try to rebuild their margin with GOP gerrymandering in Pennsylvania. I think that, these are the first big gun massacres in the new Biden administration. And I think that the political heat is going to go way up on the GOP and the NRA, which has also been proven to be a deeply corrupt organization stealing from NRA members. I mean, they've just been looting the treasury for the people who run it. So I think we've got a chance here. And who knows? The gun violence may be the issue. The background check and closing the Charleston loophole, which we did, moving from 3 days. And if the FBI hasn't completed the background check, you get the gun, which is how the white supremacist got the gun to go and kill the worshipers at the AME church in Charleston, South Carolina. We moved that from 3 days to 10 days and shifted the burden so you don't automatically get it in the event that they're still trying to determine whether or not you're in fact a felon. So I think if we turn up the heat, this might be the issue either that is the straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of the NRA's power, or alternatively, it might be the issue that is the straw that breaks the camel's back for filibuster.
Right. And of course, the difference is this time we have a president who is determined to do something about it and will fight for it, as opposed to fighting against it, which certainly a difference in the way things work here in Washington. Congressman, one other issue, very important to those of us who live on the Hill and live in the District of Columbia, was the subject of a big hearing in the House this week, and that is possibility of statehood for the District of Columbia. Do you support it, and how do you weigh its chances?
Well, I strongly support it because statehood is the way that people gain their political equality and equal representation rights in the country. We started with 13 states. We've added 37 states, which means that nearly 3/4 of the states have been admitted since the Union was first created, and that was totally Jefferson's contemplation. If you go back and look at what he said at the time of the Northwest Ordinance, he said, we're not designed to be a colonial power where we have all these colonial possessions and we rule over people without their participation. We're designed to be a nation where people learn about democracy and then they gain their admission as states. And obviously, the people, the 712,000 draft-paying taxable citizens in Washington, D.C., who pay more in absolute terms in federal taxes than people in half the states. Those people are clearly ready for statehood. And our friends in the GOP keep throwing up every conceivable imaginary argument. Like yesterday, they mentioned that there weren't any car dealerships in the District of Columbia, which turned out not to be true. And then I turned to them and I said, so now you guys are going to support statehood for people in Washington, right? Now that you determined that there were actually car dealerships. They were saying there weren't bowling alleys and, all of these nonsense arguments that are not actual conditions precedent, not actual requirements. And so I think that, in the House, we will blow past all of those arguments. We will allow the general trajectory of democratic inclusion to keep rolling. We will support statehood for Washington, D.C., which now would stand for Washington Douglas County after Frederick Douglass. But the federal district remains in shrunken form. It's the White House and the Capitol and the Supreme Court and other federal buildings in the National Capital Service area, the mall area, so that Article 1, Section 8.7, Clause 17, which is the district clause, is still vindicated. Congress still governs this federal district. And let's hope we'll be able to do a better job defending the Congress against the next mob of marauding Trump supporters who decide to conduct an insurrection against us.
So, and let's be clear, Congressman, for that everyone understands. I saw that one Republican member of the committee said that the Congress does not have the constitutional authority to grant statehood. That's not true, is it?
It's only Congress that has the authority under Article 4 to grant statehood. There's never been a state admitted by way of constitutional amendment or by way of judicial action, nor has there ever been a statehood admission that has been struck down by any court in the land, including the U.S. Supreme Court. It's a political question. It's non-justiciable, which means the Supreme Court says that's up to Congress to decide. It's not up to us. So that's the exact opposite of the truth. And Congress clearly has the authority to modify the boundaries of the federal district. It did this back in 1846 when it decided to redraw the District of Columbia, to shrink it, to subtract the lands that were Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax County, and retrocede them to Virginia. And that was challenged unsuccessfully. So it's a political question. It's totally up to Congress. which exercises exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over the district that is the seat of government.
Well, without getting our hopes up too high, Congressman, some have pointed out now with a majority still in the House, slim, but still in a majority in the House, and at least a 50-50 split with the vice president there to break a tie in the Senate, that this may be the best chance in a long time to get statehood for D.C. Would you?
Well, that's right. Of course, you need 60 votes to invoke cloture against a filibuster. And certainly there are enough senators who are dead set opposed to democracy that they would try to filibuster it. And that's why it might trigger the filibuster question that's on everybody's mind. The interesting thing is that lots of states, have entered the union in pairs, like animals boarding Noah's Ark. Kansas, Nebraska, Hawaii, Alaska, Maine, and Kentucky. And so, although we like to think that the states are admitted just out of abstract concern for political philosophy and equal rights, in fact, it's always been infused with partisan and sectional and racial conflict. Okay, that's a reality, and clearly the Republicans want to make this a political football. But here's the interesting thing. There's another state out there, another potential state that the Republicans have supported for admission for many decades, and that's Puerto Rico. It's been in the Republican national platform for many decades. The current resident commissioner, which is what they call their delegate from Puerto Rico, is a Republican. And the Republicans have said they're for this for a long time. So the makings of a deal are there. If they really support Puerto Rican statehood, as they claim to do, and that's not a fraud also, they should step up and say, okay, the Democrats are strongly supporting Washington, D.C. The Republicans want Puerto Rico. Let's bring them in together. So let's see if they're for real about that and that there is, in fact, no racism involved in this debate at all.
So not to make this too local, but probably the issue that residents of the Hill care the most about, Congressman, is the fence. The fence that finally, part of the fence, is down. I walked down there today to check it out. I guess the question is, why did it stay up so long? And when is the rest of the fence around the Capitol going to go down so we have access to the People's House?
Nobody wants the fence, least of all the Democrats, who've always championed open access to government, although not open access to violent insurrectionists who want to try to overturn election results. So all of it, of course, is due to the January 6th insurrection that was incited by Donald Trump. We believe that after the various measures undertaken by Speaker Pelosi and the majority, that we are secure. We be secure against another effort to try to overthrow the Constitution and overthrow Congress. So I think that we are moving quickly to try to dismantle the fence that nobody wants. And we just want to make sure also that people aren't bringing arms onto the floor of the House. There are members of Congress who are seeking the right to bring guns there, which we are not going to do because we don't need guns there. And if they had guns on January 6th, a lot of us are not sure who they would have used those guns against, the insurrectionists who they were giving a lot of aid and comfort to, or against us.
Congressman, related to the insurrection, you have asked the FBI to investigate troubling incidences of extremists infiltrating our law enforcement based on what we saw at the Capitol. Where is that right now, and why is that so important?
Well, there's a wonderful Capitol officer named Officer Dunn, who I actually quoted anonymously during the impeachment trial. He was the one who was battling the mob for 4 or 5 hours and then came inside and, yelled in frustration. I got called an N-word 15 times today. Is this America, man? One of the things that he said to me was that he couldn't believe there were people identifying themselves to him as police officers who were in the mob. And sure enough, there were arrests of more than a dozen people who were police officers, not on the Capitol Police Force or not on the Metropolitan Police Department, but from other parts of the country who came to join Trump's mob to try to attack the Capitol. And this followed up on evidence that we had in the Oversight Committee and the Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, which I chair, that there were conscious strategies being undertaken by violent extremist groups, racist white nationalist groups, to infiltrate police departments so people could be armed, so they wouldn't have to worry about police detection themselves, so they could use their force of arms against African American citizens and Hispanic citizens and other racial minorities, and so they could get better access to elected officials and government plans and so on. So that's truly alarming that there are deliberate efforts by violent extremist groups to infiltrate law enforcement, and the fact that it was either 17 or 18 of these people were picked up on January 6th is profoundly disturbing. So we had asked the FBI about this long before January 6th. And under President Trump, they said that they had no reason to believe this was a problem and they didn't want to testify, and they basically blew us off. After January 6th, after all of these arrests, I wrote back to FBI Director Wray. I told him that we wanted him to come and testify in a hearing about racist organization infiltration of law enforcement and the threat that it presents to public safety, and we are still trying to work that out right now.
The first big accomplishment of the Biden administration is what they call the American Rescue Plan. Passed the House, passed the Senate. The president has signed it. Members of the administration from the president on down are out around the country today, letting people know what's in this plan, in addition to the $1,400 checks. As former Vice President Joe Biden might say, this really is a BFD, isn't it, in terms of legislation?
Absolutely. I mean, from my perspective, having spent a long time now working on the events of January 6th and the impeachment of Donald Trump for his high crimes and misdemeanors against the country, the American Rescue Plan is the decisive answer to the chaos and the violence unleashed against us. It's the decisive answer because it shows that democracy can work for the people. So this is the real refutation of Donald Trump and the madness of his administration and his movement. The real answer is showing that in democracy, the government is an instrument of the common good and the public interest. And so with this tremendous plan that President Biden helped to get through the House and the Senate, we're putting the shots in the arms. We're going to get the kids back in school by getting the money into the school systems. We're going to get people back to work. We're going to get people their checks, get money in the bank. We are going to revive the public health infrastructure. We're going to replenish the vaccine in the country. We're going to make the government work for the people. And what we saw over the last 4 years was government not as an agent of the common good, but government as an instrument of private self-enrichment, money-making for the president, for his family, for his friends, and then essentially efforts to demoralize the workforce, undermine the government, so people lose faith in it. And I mean, that's really the two visions that were at war. We basically were turned into a failed state. When you look at what happened with COVID-19, well, we were number one in the world in death count, number one in the world in case count, number one in the world in COVID propaganda. And the president of the United States himself was trafficking in magical thinking, like this is all going to disappear on Easter, or it's by the 4th of July, it's going to all be gone, or promoting quack miracle cures like we're going to inject people with bleach, or pitting the states against each other, totally thwarting the constitutional design where it's the federal government that should be coordinating action among the states and making the country work together as a whole. And instead, we pitted them against each other, and the president was doing everything he could to make war on the governors and on the states. For example, when he fomented violent insurrection in Michigan against Governor Whitmer, who was the target of an assassination and kidnapping conspiracy.
So, and the president has indicated clearly that this is basically just the first step, right? Now they're talking about a $3 trillion follow-up plan with infrastructure, with investment in alternative energy, and not to mention voting rights and other legislation on climate change, all of which gets us to something that you have mentioned a couple of times already, Congressman, the reality of the filibuster in the Senate. What do you believe the Democratic leadership in the Senate, Democrats in the Senate, should do about the filibuster? Kill it or reform it?
We should try to get rid of it. And if we can't get rid of it, we should reform it, but we should try to abolish it. But let me go back to the point you made that was so important. I don't want us to skip over this.
Sure.
We are going to invest in the ailing, crumbling infrastructure of America. This is what Donald Trump should have done his first week in office. And he probably would have, he promised to do it, and he probably would have handed us our rear end politically had he actually focused on it. But they didn't have any interest in governing. The GOP is not a governing party anymore. They just want to vilify and demonize and so on. So he wanted to go after the immigrants, and he wanted to shut down the government, and he wanted to attack foreign leaders. So that was what he wanted to do. He didn't want to invest in infrastructure. So now it's another 4 years late. But President Biden, the Biden-Harris administration, are committed to making government work for the country. So we're going to invest in the infrastructure, in the roads and the highways and the mass transit systems. We're going to invest in the ports and the airports and cybersecurity and everything that is collapsing in the country. And that's something, again, that unifies the vast majority of the American people of whatever political persuasion. But we know that they're going to fight us. The Republicans in the Senate are going to try to stop us because they don't want government to succeed. So if this is going to be the Battle of Gettysburg over the filibuster, then let's have the conversation about whether we should be investing in the American infrastructure, getting those great jobs for working people, moving small businesses, or not. The GOP had no problem cutting $1.5 trillion worth of tax cuts for their best friends in the wealthiest companies and the wealthiest individuals in America. That's just money down the drain. But money that you invest in the infrastructure comes back to America. It moves our economy. It doesn't get shipped overseas to Swiss bank accounts in the Bimini Islands.
So back to the filibuster, if you were to reform it, what would you suggest? What are the ways to maybe get enough votes, right, that to make some change?
Well, let's start with this. Here's why I would get rid of it, Bill. I mean, majority rule is the basic principle and assumption of our Constitution. So when we vote in the House, unless the Constitution otherwise specifies it's 2/3, it's a majority vote. And it's the same thing in the Senate, unless it specifies for something like a veto override or the adoption of a treaty, it's a majority vote. Even the Supreme Court, when it votes, is 5-4. So it's very odd to institute a rule which says you actually need 60 votes in order to pass legislation rather than 51 votes. So that's anti-democratic. The Senate already operates on an undemocratic principle, as you know. It's not one person, one vote based on districts of relatively equal size, which is what we've got in the House. It's California on the one hand, and then you've got, Rhode Island on the other hand. You've got New York State,
Wyoming.
you've got North Dakota, and Wyoming, right? So we can't overlook the fact that there's a partisan dimension to this, which is why the Republicans are hanging on for dear life to the filibuster. When I was over in the Senate, one of the things I learned was that Democrats in the Senate represent 40 million more people than Republicans in the Senate, which is pretty extraordinary when you think about it. So then that's 50-50. When you say 41 senators can block 59 senators, theoretically, you could have much less than a quarter of the population thwarting the progress seen by 3/4 of the population. So we need to do it. I think it's a democratic imperative. Some of the reforms short of abolition are okay, but they're not great. I mean, when we say, for example, we should have just a standing filibuster, which means, okay, you can still filibuster and you need 60 votes to block it. But now, rather than just as a senator being able to say, I'm going to stop that unless you can get 60 votes to stop me, I actually have to stand up and spend the night speaking on my feet, old-fashioned filibuster style. That's an improvement because it requires some investment on the part of the senator. On the other hand, in the age of the internet, you can imagine a lot of these senators loving to do that as a way to get internet notoriety and fame and do fundraising around it. So I'm not sure that doesn't get to the heart of the problem. One solution that I think is a little bit more of an improvement is rather than saying you need 60 votes to invoke cloture, you could say that you need 41 votes to prevent cloture. In other words, cloture could be assumed that if somebody says, okay, this person's put a hold on my bill, I am going to introduce a measure saying that I've got 60 votes on my side. They've got to prove, no, I don't, by going to get 41 people who will say, for example, we will filibuster the universal background check on violent criminals buying guns.
Mm-hmm. Just one final point on that. Mitch McConnell went on the floor of the Senate today and excoriated Democrats for suggesting that the filibuster had anything to do with racism. You're an American historian, Congressman. It's nothing but a racist tool, is it?
Well, they're probably going to hang their hat on the idea that it didn't start as a racist tool. And, it started at a time of racism, but it was probably not directly for racist purposes. But when you look at it historically, it was used as a way to block anti-lynching legislation, to block civil rights legislation. It was always the enemy of civil rights legislation in the 20th century.
Bill Press with Congressman Jamie Raskin. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit billpresspods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Jonathan Allen, Fred Wertheimer, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.